Hi, this is going to be the first of two videos on campaign finance in US politics. This particular one, I'm going to look at why they are so expensive and then just briefly go through or describe the attempts at reform that have been made. So, firstly, why are US elections so expensive? Well, in 2012, the congressional and presidential elections between them spent around $5 billion, which is obviously a huge amount. There are a number of reasons why this is the case. The first reason is the length of the actual election campaign. So if you compare to Britain, which takes place, over about 5 or 6 weeks, in the United States it takes place at least over 12 months if you include all the primaries, then the actual general election campaign. And even longer if you include the invisible primary beforehand. Secondly, is the geographical size of the United States. Candidates need lots of money in order to travel from place to place. The distance from Florida to, say, New Hampshire or to Colorado is actually quite large and therefore need an aeroplane, etc, etc. A third potential reason is the population size. So the population in the United States, or the electorate, is over 200 million compared to something like Britain where the electorate is probably about 40 to 50 million. So the population size is obviously much greater and therefore more stuff needs to go out. A further reason for the expense is the more sophisticated election techniques that are being used. The use of computers and phone-ins and all that kind of stuff. And then finally, of course, the main expense goes on TV adverts, which is the main way which candidates attack and promote themselves and their opponents. So, let's have a quick look at some of the attempts to reform the system. Well, the first major attempt took place in 1974 with the Federal Election Campaign Act, or FECA. This was done in wake of the Watergate crisis, when there's a whole evaluation of the way that US politics worked at a national level. Now, the FECA had a number of restrictions on campaign finance. The first one was that all campaign contributions had to be declared. Secondly, they tried to restrict the donation size, so an individual was only allowed to donate $20,000 to a political party and $1,000 directly to a candidate. Organisations and pressure groups were limited to $5,000 for a candidate's campaign, and they had to do so through a Political Action Committee, or PAC. Now, the PAC, which the pressure group was allowed to form, had to have at least 50 donors and had to give money to at least 5 candidates. The other way which the FECA worked was to introduce something called matching funds, and the idea was that if candidates would limit the amount they raise via private donations, then the federal government would provide the rest of the money, i.e. matching the funds. Now, this piece of legislation didn't take long before it began to be watered down, and the first major case was 1976 with Buckley versus Valeo from the Supreme Court. Now, the Supreme Court stated that it was unconstitutional for a private individual to spend his or her own money on their own campaign. So let's say, and this wouldn't happen with my teacher's wage, but let's say I was very wealthy, the Supreme Court said I could spend as much of my money as I wanted on my own campaign and it couldn't be restricted. Also, a few years after that, you had something called soft money, and the FEC, the Federal Election Commission, which was supposed to regulate the campaign finance, it removed some of the restrictions on fundraising for campaigns that promoted the awareness of elections, and this became the so-called soft money donations. And the Democrats first used it in 1988 to issue adverts, so they wouldn't directly name the candidate, but they'd have adverts which supported the candidate's issues, i.e. liberal issues. And then the Republicans, of course, soon followed suit. We then come on to 2002 with the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, also known as McCain-Feingold, named after the two senators, John McCain and Russ Feingold, who introduced it into the Senate. And this put on a number of restrictions onto campaign finance. Firstly, hard money contributions was now lifted to $2,000 per annum. PAC contributions remain limited to $5,000. They banned soft money contributions, and pressure groups were also banned from airing TV or radio electioneering adverts 1 month before a primary election and 2 months before a general election. And this was hoped to deal with some of the excesses, if you like, of what happened beforehand. By 2004, and the general election that took place for president in 2004, again this was beginning to get watered down. You had something called 527 committees were formed. And what was noted, was by trade unions first of all, was that soft money did not apply to non-party organisations. And so trade unions were first to adopt something called Section 527 of the Tax Code, which was used for this, hence the name. And in 2004 they began to use adverts which attacked George W. Bush. The Bush campaign then responded, or the supporters of George W. Bush then responded by running their own adverts. One of the big features of 527 was they weren't allowed to coordinate with the campaign of the actual candidate. They kind of ran as a shadow to them. But individuals could spend an awful lot. So in 2004, $400 million was spent by 527 committees. 146 million of those dollars was donations by just 25 people. However, the biggest restriction or watering down of McCain-Feingold was in 2010 with the Supreme Court's decision, Citizens United versus the FEC. The Supreme Court struck down the issue of pressure group advertising, so they thought those bans were unconstitutional. Secondly, previously only money raised by companies, particularly for campaign purposes, so they could raise their own money but say it was for campaign purposes, could be donated to campaigns. The Supreme Court struck this down, and so any money from a company could go towards an election campaign. They did, though, leave in place some of the restrictions on PAC contribution sizes, direct contributions. They all remained in place. Now, there have been some consequences of Citizens United, as you might expect, and 2010 congressional elections and then really 2012 presidential election was the first post-elections under, or since this legislation was passed, or since this decision was passed. Now, one of the big changes has been something called super PACs, which I'll discuss in my next video. And that has basically led to big individual or company contributions to election campaigns. 2012 was the most expensive election ever, with over $1 billion being spent on the presidential election and over $4 billion on the congressional elections. I'll talk more about PACs or super PACs in the next video. A good book to look at on this is William Story's book on page 154 to 161 of his second edition, and Ashby's book on his third edition is also good on this area.